Well, good afternoon, maybe still morning for some of you on the West Coast, but thank you all for joining us today on our webinar about how to end fees and discharge debt in the criminal justice system and how to drive reform in your community on these issues. Today, we are going to be talking to advocates and government about how we do this work, what they've learned in doing this work, and what they can share with us so that hopefully all of us can start to push these reforms in our own communities and go back and start strategizing around how we can follow the great lead of the people who have been joining us today. And we really want this to be a conversation that is very interactive. So please there is a Q&A feature in the Zoom system. That's how we'll be taking question and answers today. We'll try to pull from that as we are going along in the webinar. But of course, at the end, we will go back through and get those answered as well. So today we are so fortunate to be joined by this really great, awesome panel of women today who are going to be talking about all of these issues. How do we do this? Why do we do this? What more can we do? And what have we learned, right? This process is not linear. It is ongoing for sure. And there's just so much to share as we are trying to build momentum in this space. I think all of you who are here today may know this, but it's really important for us to say that, fines and fees, while we often talk about them together because that package really is the debt that people are carrying in their everyday lives, they are different. They serve a different purpose in this system. Especially when we're talking here exclusively about the adult system, they do different things and they probably have different strategies when we're talking about reform. And so today, this is a conversation around fees, and fees are something that are added into fines to generate revenue, cover costs, and become part of the government's budget and operational fiscal infrastructure. And so that's what we're here to talk about today. How do those show up? What can we do about it? And the real policy goal in that space is elimination. It's to end these fees where they show up. So today we're really fortunate to be joined by Commissioner Tony Carter from Ramsey County, who has been doing this work for a few years on the county level. So we're going to get to have that great perspective of not only from a government actor, but how do you do this work locally and what does that look like? We're also joined by Stephanie Campos-Bowie, who works for the UC Berkeley PAC and has been a leader in the debt-free justice campaign and really in the work in the juvenile justice fines and fees world. And she's really going to be able to share what California has been a leader on the state level on a lot of this work, driver's license suspension on fines and fees, and really in the last couple of years, some really, really great work on fee elimination that we love to hear from Stephanie about. And we're so fortunate to be joined by FFJC's New York State Director, Antonia Jeffrey, who is part of the coalition leading the work in New York on both phone call fees and eliminating the mandatory surcharge in New York. So we care about that campaign, how it's going, what we're learning. And all of these places are in a different space, different strategies, different ways that they're thinking about it. So there's just a lot to share. And today I'm also joined by FFJC's Senior Policy Counsel, Chanel Johnson, who's going to be moderating the panel with me, and also is the lead in FFJC on our policy guide. So she's really the mastermind behind our fee elimination guide. And so I'm going to kick it over to Chanel to just give you all a quick overview of that guide, know it's a resource and tool for you, and then we'll get started. Chanel.
Thanks, Priya. Hello, everyone. So just to give you a little background about why we decided to publish our most recent policy guidance on ending fees. Just over the last few years, we've seen a growing number of jurisdictions that have started to undertake fee elimination reform efforts, and those efforts have really ranged from campaigns to eliminate all fees to campaigns targeting one or a few specific fees. They're happening at the state level, the local level, in red states, blue states, really all over the country. So in order to highlight those efforts and help other jurisdictions capitalize on that growing momentum that Priya was talking about, we recently released the policy guidance, which is titled End Fees, Discharge Debt, and Fairly Fund Government. And the guidance is really intended to be a resource for government leaders and advocates, and provide them with the information that they need in order to drive fee elimination work in their jurisdictions. So we start with a comprehensive overview of the history of fees, including some of the earliest documented use of fees as a part of convict leasing during the Reconstruction era, up through the Great Recession of 2008 and 2009, where we saw practically every state and local government deepen their reliance on fees in order to fill budget gaps. We also would discuss the present day landscape of fees. So fees can be charged at practically every stage of an individual's involvement with the criminal legal system. So we describe the number and types of fees that an individual may encounter. We also highlight the harms and the racial and economic injustices that result from the imposition and collection of fees, and provide recommendations for jurisdictions that are new to the work and really looking to undertake some of this fee elimination and discharging debt work. So just really quickly, some of the recommendations that we include in the policy guidance that I want to highlight for you today include recommendations around eliminating all court fees, of course, while backfilling any actual revenue lost from those eliminated fees, eliminating all debt, expunging warrants, stopping all collections, and reinstating driver's licenses that were suspended for court debt. Also funding government through general funds and equitable revenue sources. And lastly, eliminating fees for medical visits, phone calls, emails, video communications, et cetera, for people who are in custody, as well as ending markups on items that are purchased in commissary. So just one other thing that we think is really important and really, useful, I think, about our guidance is the way we sort of profile dozens of states and local jurisdictions that have recently eliminated fees. Like I said, there's been growing momentum and lots happening over the last few years. So we include lots of examples and do our best to include as much information as we can about what the processes look like, the partners that were involved, and of course, any budgetary or financial information related to those efforts. So that is a really quick overview of the guidance. We do hope that you take a look at it. Feel free to reach out to us if you have questions or are interested in additional information related to the guidance. But we do think that, especially today, the best way to learn about what's happening and, sort of like what's been working and some of the challenges and roadblocks and all of those things is to hear from our panelists. So we do have some questions prepared, so I'm going to jump right into the questions. And the first one that we have, I'm actually going to pose it to all of our panelists. And oftentimes, and many of you might agree with this, getting started can be the most difficult part of the work to eliminate fees. So can each of you share how the fee elimination work in your jurisdiction started, and the role of other reforms like debt-based driver's license work, the role that played in your fee elimination efforts? So I guess we can start with Stephanie and then Antonia, and then finish up with Commissioner Carter.
Great, thank you for having me in this part of this conversation. Really excited to share all the things that we've learned. I think it's worth naming in California that young people in Los Angeles County were talking about fees back actually in 2009 and identifying it as a problem well before, many of us were talking about it. So that was 6 years before the Department of Justice's investigation into Ferguson. And actually the Youth Justice Coalition specifically was able to achieve the first moratorium on this issue. And so just all a way of saying that I think impacted people continue to be ahead of the game in so many ways. And so really just stress the importance of including impacted voices in any of these campaigns. For us, Debt Free Justice California, which is the coalition that I'm a part of, is a coalition of over 50 different advocacy, research, legal aid, and base building groups across the state that really came together in 2018 on the heels of some really great successes on the juvenile fee side. So able to abolish juvenile fees in California, as well as some really great wins on the driver's license side, restoring driver's license for so many folks. And so both of our coalitions kind of came together to ask ourselves, you know, what was possible, as we all knew that so many of the clients and partners that we were working with were facing fees. And so part of that conversation too, and coming together, was just a recognition that in the number of years that we'd been working on this issue, we saw just a shift in conversation, both amongst partners, but also policymakers. And so arguments that had been really difficult to make about, you know, the disproportionate impact on Black and Brown Californians were now just taken as kind of common knowledge. And I think about one of the most conservative supervisors in a local county that first took action on this issue. You know, that was someone who on juvenile fees didn't want to hear it, didn't want to talk about it. And when we came to him to talk about adult fees, he was like, I get it. I understand that this has a disproportionate impact on our Black residents. And we didn't even have to have an argument about it. And so for us, we knew that there was just some room for imagination and working on this. And so that's kind of why we came together and how we started.
For New York, well, let me backtrack a little bit. I'm really glad to be a part of this conversation because I always am looking for something to pull from other people across the country to bring into New York's work, because New York is incredibly diverse, regardless of what it appears to be on the national scale. Like when you come and do local work across the state, it's incredibly diverse and you need different strategies for different parts of the state. I'd say that the work in its current form started a few years ago when it was after Ferguson and after the Dear Colleague letter, after everyone realized that especially local jurisdictions were relying heavily on fines and fees for budget, to fill budget gaps, and how that reliance ends up with law enforcement interactions with Black and Brown communities unnecessarily and disproportionately to other communities. What was the result here in New York? At least in New York City, it was a huge report from the commissioner that kind of examined all of those fines and fees and emphasized the need to put a stop to it. Legislators joined on, not just New York City legislators, but legislators from across the state. And that's where it was born in its current iteration. But there's been attention to specific fees for a while now. The current iteration of the mandatory surcharge has been in place since like the late 80s, early 90s, and steadily increasing without any monitoring or anyone really raising any issues. It's only when you realize, like when you zoom in and you realize where revenue comes from, that more attention to fees started being exposed. The coalition kind of came together pretty organically after that call out in New York City. A number of the organizations that are interested in reducing or shrinking the carceral system and also making sure that everything across the state, not only with the criminal legal system, but also with housing and education, are equitable. Fees just came out as like the number one thing that we really need to address in order to get moving on all of these other things. And the coalition came about because of that. And we kind of organically fell together with some organizations like defenders groups and advocacy groups, some base building groups, some government relations folks, all had an interest in this, but no one really had an expertise. And I think that the collaboration started with the Driver's License Suspension Reform Act here in New York State, and then just naturally ascended to fee elimination as like, what's next? We made a really good stride in eliminating this one unnecessary revenue source. What can we do next to have a greater impact and to increase equity amongst low-income communities and communities of color? And now the coalition in its current iteration is about 2 years old. So is the legislation. And I think that we're at a good pace. There's a lot of momentum behind this particular issue. And if you know New York State politics, it can take a decade to really move on something. But this is something that we've been seeing moving in the past 3 years at a rate that other issues don't necessarily get that attention. So it's really exciting at this point.
Thank you. Again, I'm Toni Carter. I'm a commissioner on the Ramsey County Board of Commissioners, and I've served since 2005. Ramsey County is the most diversely populated county in the state of Minnesota. And as such, it's been very important to us to understand what that means for the work that we have to do at the core. Our strategic plan and priorities address engaging our community to understand fully the transformative efforts that must be put in place in order to ensure equity. If we cannot do that, we cannot be a successful county. And we hope that over the years past, we've been able to shine light on a number of areas that have helped others in Minnesota and hopefully throughout the country address the engagement of community, particularly those most impacted, toward transforming systems to better ensure that all of us can live safe and vibrant lives. In fact, our mission statement is a vibrant community where all are valued and thrive. This area of work around fines and fees actually started, I can recall, I think it was in a 2016 board meeting when we discovered a strange little fee that was about booking into our detention center, our adult detention center. Now, this after many, many years of looking at our youth system and working with organizations like the Annie E. Casey Foundation, the Burns Institute on transforming our youth system. So our eyes were keen, and the opportunity to look at our adult system as well was an area that we were beginning to move into where justice is concerned, but we noticed this $25 booking fee. And the booking fee was charged to every individual booked. And we began to ask questions about it. It was true that in 2008-9 or so, we plugged a budget gap. We were able to charge for that booking, and we had begun to do so. And in 2016, we were still doing so. We looked at that fee and we had some conversation about it. And what we found out from the sheriff was that it was problematic. It was a fee that could only be collected if you had cash in your pocket and you came to jail. If you had a credit card, it was just too burdensome. You know, our systems were not built to be able to collect that. Well, we went, and began to understand the extent to which that small fee affected low income people of color who were unbanked much, much more than it did those who had credit cards. So we eliminated that fee. But that was the beginning of an inquiry around what else is impacting people. And I'm glad to say that that is not the only fee that we eliminated. We looked across the system and we eliminated a number of fees, starting in our sheriff's office with that $25 fee. The next year, we looked at corrections, and corrections reduced its fees for probation. They cut them in half from $300 down to $150 for clients that were being administered. DWI offenses and other misdemeanors and gross misdemeanor offenses. And so we cut that fee. The following year, we looked deeper into corrections, and we looked at nurses and dentists fees and prescription fees and over-the-counter medical drugs and things of that sort. And we continued to look. Finally, we were able to work with PFM, and they helped us with a systematic review of those fines and fees. But in essence, we are building on a strategic priority, which is to create justice system outcomes that mirror our community's values. And once again, we value a community where health and wellness and opportunity exist for all. We are using our resources and examining our processes to ensure the work that we do contributes to that.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Carter, and everyone. Every time I hear you speak, Commissioner Carter, I'm always like hopeful what all can start to happen for sure. So, one thing I heard from this is a theme of, looking at the juvenile system, like help to lay a foundation for understanding, right, the issue of fines and fees. There are some different arguments, there are some different considerations, but that concept of driver's license suspensions or juvenile fines and fees, these entry points, right, into the work that allow us to sort of seed the ground of what is really going on with our system and allow people to start taking action on some things that they are comfortable with while you're simultaneously educating them for your next go round of what you're coming back to do. To me is just such a brilliant way to think about, one, we're all in this for the long run, but two, how do all these things build on each other? So that's really great. California's efforts, as I understand them, I mean, there are nearly 100 fees in the criminal legal system there, and California's efforts are a goal of eliminating all the fees. Well, Ramsey County started with small targeting specific fees. Can you sort of both speak, and maybe let's start with Stephanie, speak to this strategy of you have 100 fees or about 100 fees in California, which is a lot of fees, of why did you pick them all versus starting with one? And then we'll give it over to Commissioner Carter, sort of the other approach, right? You saw something, you did something, and then you started going down. So, there's both successful in different ways, but kind of hear how you made those decisions. So start with you, Stephanie.
Great. Yeah, I think one of the things that we did early on in looking at the over 90 something fees that could be charged to Californians in our criminal system was seeing if we could, prioritize in some way, what the amounts looked like, where was the money going, who was being charged, at what point in the system. And when we did that, at the end of the day, I think the coalition realized like there was no way for us to prioritize one over the other or pit one against the other in that way. And I think part of that was also out of recognition that, all of us were here for the long run. Like this wasn't a one-year campaign. And so I think it really emboldened us to want to try to tackle it all. I think part of that also was informed by growing momentum in California. So there were some localities who had acted in advance of when we went to the state level. So, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Alameda County, Contra Costa County had all eliminated fees within their discretion. And so there was some proof of concept. I think the other reason why we went for all of them at once, I think, was to not necessarily negotiate against ourselves, mindful of the fact that, starting with a subset, what that could mean for future reform at the state level for a coalition like us. And I think it's been clear now that we've been doing this for a number of years. The folks in Sacramento know, okay, Debt-Free Justice California, we know that they're not going to stop until it comes to the end. So I think from a communications marketing perspective, like I think it's been helpful to, people know we're going for them all. But that's not to say that we did leave some stuff on the cutting room floor. I do want to be clear about that. There are some other, I'm going to say fees in California. They're called penalty assessments, surcharges. So there were a number of other things that we were considering throwing into the mix that we didn't. And so I definitely don't want to discount the fact that there sometimes needs to be prioritization. But for us, we decided that when we talk about fees, we were going to go for it all. And it was funny when the first bill was finally went through Ledge Council and came back, our author, Senator Mitchell, sent a picture of us of the bill. It was like a 3-pound 4-manila folder bill and was the longest bill that anyone had ever seen. But it's been the foundation for this work. And again, I think it's a lot from the values of who's in our coalition and what they saw as justice in the long term around this issue.
Thank you. So again, I told you a little story about our booking fee, and that did open our eyes and it caused us to look deeper. Again, also based on our priorities for our strategic plan for our community. We have built a process of working with community and particularly with those most impacted. And so together with us in areas such as our Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative or in our community or criminal justice coordinating committee, we've done a number of things where we've looked at issues, an issue in particular with our criminal. I have difficulty saying criminal justice. I always want to say community justice, but it is with our criminal justice coordinating committee. We did a project on warrant resolution. So ensuring that warrants didn't continue to be added to and cause that circle of engagement with our justice system, such as we see around the country when a warrant or a fine can't be paid and it's added on to, and people continue to go deeper and deeper. So we did that work out of our safety and justice unit, which brings together our law enforcement entity, our courts, our county attorney, and everyone focusing in on how can we make certain that we do not continue to have people caught up in this tangled town. Well, that's one area of work. Another area of work, and incidentally where our corrections department is located, is our health and wellness department, where we have our social services and financial services and public health folks located. So as we were asking these questions about where else, they shared with us, with the County Board of Commissioners, those areas where public health, for example, for the health charges within our correction center, could find places for us to go look, dig, and hopefully turn up. And we were able to, because we were addressing the multiple impacts of these systems on impacted people, we were able to hear from folks who were in our corrections facility how, in fact, these costs would cause them to be deciding whether they were going to feed a child or if they were going to pay a bill. And you know the decision that has to be made in that case. So we just kept digging. The approach is focusing on our goals of health and opportunity and well-being, opportunity for prosperity for all. So we continue to, in a connected way with departments within our service teams, such as within that safety and justice area that brings together law enforcement and our courts and our attorney and others, and that area of health and wellness that brings together our corrections together with public health and financial assistance services and social services, all eyes on this goal of ensuring that we can align our system's outcomes to the expectations and values of our community, not just for our community, but with our community. And that's how we're doing the work.
Really great. Antonia, your approach in New York, or the coalition, I'm saying your, but I know it's a part of a team, the coalition's work in New York is, I would say, more similar to the California sort of strategy. There is a more comprehensive bill in play, but there is also a separate bill, which is the phone call fees bill that you are running in New York. How is New York thinking about sort of these things, about everything, some individual things, and how did you build coalitions and consensus around those differences? And one thing to know is, if I understand it correctly, your mandatory surcharge bill, there is also a piece on mandatory minimums of fines that you have in that bill. And so this sort of, as we're talking about laying the seeds and foundations for all the work, we know that when we get rid of fees, we're coming to talk about fines in the adult space. And so how are you all thinking about that, and how do all of these pieces work together in New York?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll start with the phone call justice, the fee elimination bill for prisons and jails. That came along. You would think that it should be involved if you're doing a really big statewide bill that's attacking all of the fees within the criminal legal system, that would be involved. But that actually, and this is to show how local work kind of extends to state work, because that came on the back of a local campaign that we were involved in to eliminate phone call fees in Rikers in New York City. And it was like a natural progression from there. We can do it in New York City, the largest city in New York State. We can definitely get rid of it statewide. And so the folks that worked on that city bill kind of joined in and brought in other cities, other advocates from other parts of the state in order to form the coalition that's now trying to eliminate phone call fees, communication fees, really, both on the state level with DOCS, our corrections department here, and on the county level. And it is ambitious. I'll pause on phone call fees to move to the End Predatory Court Fees Act, which is what's looking to eliminate the mandatory surcharge. That we have the same kind of idea as California, that we want to not negotiate against ourselves, get as much in the bill as possible, because the fact of the matter is all of the fees are predatory. All of them. So we can't justify to ourselves why we would piecemeal that in our approach to the legislature. So we have to look at the DNA data bank fee that's collected for every person on every conviction, whether or not DNA is being collected or not, is just as predatory as the crime victim assistance fee, which is controversial. But even if you're in a, even if you're involved in something that has no victim per se, that fee is still charged. And we got to look at, we had to take a look at how this is applied to every single conviction and every single person, regardless of the circumstance, and the fact that there's no way to kind of piecemeal and like say, okay, this applies to this particular person versus a next, because the courts don't do that. It's one for all. And so that is also our kind of thinking when we included elimination of mandatory minimum fines in our legislation. Fees are different from fines in that culturally and societally, it is still, I guess we don't exactly know how everyone feels about reforming fines. There's still a bit of taboo around it, about, you know, just seeing like what is deserved versus what's not, what's a part of someone's sentence versus what's not. But in order to open the conversation and open the dialogue about how the way that fines are disproportionate in a very similar way to the way that fees are disproportionate, we thought that eliminating mandatory minimum fines would be a great opener to that conversation, because all it's saying is that we're now giving a judge kind of the option to say, I'm going to consider someone's ability to pay in assessing a fine versus having to meet this mandatory number, which is egregious in New York State. Mandatory minimum fines, no matter how small the misdemeanor, or even in traffic tickets, those mandatory minimum fines and fees just build up astronomically. So we needed a way to open up that conversation to kind of gauge how people feel about fines. Building the coalition for No Price on Justice has been interesting because most of the fees that we're looking to eliminate are court fees. And so we need a pretty comprehensive coalition around it. We need to be able to have some law enforcement be able to recognize the way that this is predatory and say, yes, we'll join you, as well as even victim services who know that victim services needs to be funded equitably and should not be on the backs of low-income Black and brown people. So we needed a really robust and diverse group. And the way that we've been able to pull that together is by going to each city and seeing what the fines and fees practices are there, and then seeing how people feel about it and telling them, like, come along, let's eliminate this on a statewide level. Let's do something really large. And then hopefully it can influence your local fines and fees. And there are some counties and some cities in New York that have exceptionally egregious local fees and that are not quite there yet, where Ramsey County is in recognizing that and being able to like take that on. But we're hoping that the statewide campaign kind of exposes that. Once you see the impact that eliminating these fees have, which it will have an automatic impact, hopefully going back and getting it from that end. But to tie it all together with the phone call justice fees, those fees are really impacting incarcerated people, and the fees that we're looking to eliminate with the Predatory Court Fees Act focuses on specific court-related fees. So we can justify them being separate, but I can also say that it would have worked if we did it all together. With the phone call fees, the last thing I'll say is with the phone call fees, we are also taking a pretty comprehensive approach in including both state and county level, like county jails and state facilities, because if we eliminate fees on the state level, great. That's the Department of Corrections controls everything on the state level. On the county level, you're dealing with many different jurisdictions. You're also dealing with some places where commission is collected on fees. And so you have to really negotiate that. But we thought that we would put our best foot forward and offer our resources to even help in the implementation phase on the county level, and hoping that that would help us to get more county support for the bill.
Great, thanks, Antonia. Commissioner Carter, I guess on the other hand, so to date, the work in Ramsey County hasn't been coalition-based, but you did mention your work with PFM at the top of our conversation. So I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about that experience and how that sort of impacted the work that you guys are doing now, or help build the momentum for what's happening now in the county. I will say at the Fines and Fees Justice Center, we have cities and counties for fine and fee justice, which similarly supports government actors and community representatives in their work to advance fines and fee reform. So just really interested in what that experience meant for you and how it impacted the work at the local level in Ramsey County.
Well, thank you very much. I do want to touch just on what Antonia was sharing just now. I appreciate the work that you are doing with those bigger state fines and fees as well. We did find in Ramsey County that out of $12.8 million in fees that had been assessed within a year, 53% of that fine and fee revenue was transferred to the State Department of the Treasury. There was 1.4 million that actually came to the county, and in addition to our vendors, which we have some influence over in terms of the negotiation of those fees, there was an additional $334,000. But as I look over the fees, and I just pulled it out, so much of that $12.761,888 were fees that were assessed either by the courts or by the state, and over which we have very, very little control. That was really interesting for us, and it was a reason we knew we needed help, because if we are to provide that greater impact, it would be over fees that were not underneath our control necessarily. So when PFM was provided funds to work with localities throughout the United States, we saw that as a way of getting a handle on understanding what was ours, what was assessed by us and then received by us, what in fact was authorized by us but received by the states. For example, our law library fee, which was assessed for every case, although the offenders were telling us, well, we're not using the law library, why are we paying for it? And so there are different ways of looking at that, although we don't have control over making the decision there. And of course, those assessed by the state and received by the state courts. And we want to be impactful in helping to ensure that those decisions can be made to waive those fees when necessary, to reduce or to eliminate those fees. So as we began to do this work with PFM, and they helped us look at it systematically, part of that was working to understand the views of our community. So we worked with stakeholders in every area, and there were organizations, I mentioned some of the county collaboratives earlier, but certainly local organizations that were able to work with us, our ACLU, Minnesota Freedom Fund, reentry organizations. I can't name them all, but impacted folks who came to the table from those organizations with us to say, we'll line up with you so that our voices can be heard. We can get this work done together. That has led to additional work. We're looking at bail reform now to ensure that there isn't a color of justice that's rich or poor, you know? And so all of those areas we continue to look at. I mentioned, I think, to Priya and Chanel before, that this is not just work that hones itself in on law enforcement or the courts or our attorneys. This is the big work of looking at our entire connected systems. Library fees, I mentioned, were a part of that. So again, together with our community and groups such as I mentioned, we are creating work in Ramsey County now to transform our system. So we have individuals coming to the table with us and looking at these areas, doing a deep dive and figuring out together and having the voices together to advocate for the change. Of course, with Minnesota being the epicenter for justice transformation over this past couple of years, with the law enforcement engaged deaths that we've seen here and across the country. But here in particular, we have a legislature that's very interested in public safety reform and is looking with us at policy areas, but also at these areas of cost to individuals that are limitations for families and that burden our entire communities. I hope I answered your question. I'm sorry.
Yes, you definitely did. And just building on the point that you made about sort of connecting systems and what Antonia said about coordinating between the state and local work, Stephanie, in California, we know at the same time that you were doing sort of the statewide reforms, there was also a lot happening at the local level in terms of fee elimination. So can you talk a little bit about how that local work maybe fed into the state work, influenced, or just what that all looked like?
Yeah, definitely. So when our coalition first joined in 2018, San Francisco County had just eliminated all fees. Again, like Commissioner Carter was saying, within their discretion, there were some at the state level that some of the counties couldn't touch. Shortly after that, Alameda, which is Oakland, Contra Costa, which is a little bit north, and then Los Angeles County followed. So for us, it was really helpful to have proof of concept that this was possible and the sky wasn't falling. And I think more concretely that people weren't losing their jobs, programs or services weren't being cut. And so to be able to say that, as well as have stakeholders from those localities come and testify in support of the bill at the state level. So we had a supervisor from Contra Costa County come speak about the impact, the public defender in San Francisco County. And so to have those people to rely on was incredibly helpful. Also for us, and I think particularly for LA County to take action on this, it was extremely helpful to be able to say collectively over 35% of the population are no longer facing a number of these fees because these local jurisdictions have taken action. So to show that we were almost halfway even really, I think, allowed us to convince legislators to take the next step. I think the other piece, though, that I think was a little bit difficult was the fact that you did have smaller, maybe more rural counties that, often feel like their voices aren't being heard in the legislature. And so for us trying to make sure that, those stakeholders had their voice while still, recognizing that, for a lot of places, there's not a robust organizing community. And so at the state level, that's where the action has to come from. So I think, the local level, I think, is for us, both on the adult side and the juvenile side, kind of so foundational to the work that has since come from them.
Yeah, that's all really great. I think we oftentimes think about this work as separate. What are you doing over here in this one big place or one little place? And what are we doing across the state? But really these relationships, the efforts on the local and the state, they are all advancing the same objectives, right? And so how do we use them strategically to make sure we're getting everything we want? And it happens all the time in the advocacy work where you get asked, well, who else did this? Or, what happened when so-and-so did it? Because everyone's a lot of people are scared to like be the first or to do it the first, and not have that political backlash. And to have a place that's willing to try and then tell you how, what they did and get you going in that direction is so huge. And so working on the state with local partners, local government, local actors who get it, who get the issue and will do whatever they can, even if they can't do it all, just seems like a very, very key part of all of what we're talking about here today. Now I really want to talk about the money, fines and fees, especially fees, it's about the money. It's about how we have tied our criminal legal system to fiscal policy, to budgets, to all of these things. And now we're trying to untangle this web we've created between these two things that should have never really been related in the first place, right? And so we can't have these conversations around fee elimination a lot of times without having conversations around budgets and fiscal circumstances. We just can't. And I think a lot of us who are not necessarily the fiscal experts in this work, right, have tried to go about our work doing what we know is real, which is this is harmful. This is disproportionately impacts this group of people, leading with the human impact of the work. And then comes the money question, right? And so Stephanie, in California, in addition to the significant number of fees, California's bill also included provisions discharging outstanding debt for those eliminated fees. So can you talk about, which we love, obviously, can you talk about why that was important to include, and then how like the state was able to make that work and how those conversations were able to really be had, because that's the real robust policy goal.
Yeah, and I think building on your point about the human impact, like I think that was a lot of it to demonstrate the different forms of relief that was required to really get this burden off of people. And so I guess to be clear, there are kind of like 3 levels of relief that I like to try to reinforce. The first is ending assessment. So making sure that no new fees can be charged going forward. The second being ending collection, making sure that fees that have been charged, you can't collect them anymore. And then the last part is the discharging the debt. And so, yes, you may have a county that has said, we're not going to collect anymore. But if these civil judgments still exist, liens are still being there, who's to say that, when allies like Commissioner Carter leave office and a new set of folks come on, they might restart collection efforts. And so really trying to erase everything off the books is really important, and why we try to underscore that with everyone that we talk to. I think, again, part of it was proof of concept, both at the local level, again, within their discretion, they were able to discharge some of the debt at the county level. On the juvenile fee side, just a couple of years before, that statewide bill that eliminated juvenile fees also included that discharge provision. And so there was a mechanism, language that people understood about how that had to happen. But it did require a lot of sleuthing on how this worked in practice. And so we, had lots of conversations with collections departments of like, okay, when you get this bill, what do you do? Does it automatically convert into a civil judgment? Find out that there's a thing called a signed stipulation, and there's a different way of undoing that. And so it was really important for us to do that legwork to understand, here's all the ways that you have to really untangle all of this work. And then I think the other thing that, or the last thing that I think was really persuasive to people about why discharge should be included in any of these fee elimination bills was the fact that this debt was becoming so stale and really uncollectible over time. We got a copy of an aging collections report from a county that basically showed once debt was a year old, the collection rate on average was 8%. Once it got to 2 years, it dropped to 3%. And by 3 years, 0%. So this was not money that was going to be collected. And so there was no value in keeping this on the books. And we were seeing debt that dated back to the 1970s. Like, if they had not paid by then and you were spending money to trying to collect from that person, like that is not just hard on that person, the debt looming over them, that's just fiscally irresponsible as a collections department to be spending money on debt that you're never going to collect. And so I think that too was really persuasive to folks about the importance of including that in any legislation that we worked on.
There were also provisions in your bill that backfilled county lost revenue. So can you talk a little bit about that part and how that tied into the work? And we currently know that a lot of thinking about this in real time, right? That there are a lot of state budgets that are looking really good right now. There's a lot of surplus activity out there, a lot of federal stimulus money, and folks are in the planning phases right now of what do we do with that money? How are we going to, there's all this talk about tax cuts and all these things, but this feels like a key thing that needs to be at least considered in these conversations because people aren't collecting, like you said. So if there was any time for you to actually get this money, you might want to get it from the state surplus, right? So how did this happen in California? And, I'm curious really from everyone, how do you think we can leverage that surplus conversation in real time right now as folks are having these conversations? So let's start with you, Stephanie, on the backfilling. And if any of you have thoughts about the surplus, I'd love to hear them.
Yeah, so in California, the first bill, I'll just talk about the first bill that we did for simplicity. We eliminated 23 fees, including things like the probation supervision fee, electronic monitoring, et cetera. But part of that was the state allocated $65 million every year to our 58 counties over the next 5 years. And so as much as we tried to argue that this was not a loss to counties, we obviously recognize that counties had become reliant on this as a source of revenue. And so knowing that backfill was going to be a part of the conversation, we wanted to try to inform how that was going to happen. Ideally for us, we wanted to say, this money's been taken from Black and Brown communities, let's direct it back to them. That ended up not working out. And so we got creative with how the money was going to be distributed. So it wasn't that all 58 counties were going to get their cut based on their population. It was a formula combined of population size, but also a county's average arrest rates for felonies and misdemeanors as compared to the state. And so theoretically, counties that were over arresting folks weren't going to be rewarded with more money. So that's how kind of it ended up working out. The other piece to try to make sure that we have some sense of how things are going is we ended up including some reporting requirements that I'm curious to see how they play out. Both counties are going to have to show what their average revenue loss was for the last 3 years, and of the money they get back from backfill, how they're going to spend it. What departments are they going to? What programs or services it's going to provide? So at least for us, we can say, okay, maybe 50% of it ended up going to sheriff's departments or 50% went to community-based organizations. We'll see what ends up happening. But I guess, so that gives what happened in California, and happy to talk more for folks who are interested. On the surplus point, when we did this first bill, the surplus wasn't as large as it is in California. And so for me, it's also, I think, more about the leadership of the budget chairs. Getting the eyes and the support of budget leaders, I think, whether or not is the surplus is really what I've seen has pushed the ball forward. To me, the surplus has been more persuasive for system actors, like you said, Priya. Like if you want to lock in your revenue amount now, like now's your chance to do it because your numbers are going down and they're only going to go down more. So that's where I've seen it be a little bit more persuasive for folks, but I will definitely let Antonia and Commissioner Carter weigh in.
I'm happy to.
So after oh, go ahead.
Okay. I'm sorry for bumping into you right there. I had trouble unmuting myself for a second, but I imagine, Stephanie, what you just talked about with the data that you have about collections over a year would be the same with New York. That's what we suspect. Unfortunately, New York does such a terrible job of reporting that we can't even piecemeal data that we have to make that claim, I guess we can make it, but we just can't back it up. But we know that a lot of the debt is uncollectible. And because of that, it's an active part of our strategy right now, currently, to discuss the fact that we have all of this revenue coming from the American Rescue Plan. We talked about it quite a bit beginning in October. We had a Senate hearing. It was a joint hearing with the Senate Codes Committee and the Senate Committee on Corrections, where there was testimony given in favor of the End Predatory Court Fees Act, really no testimony at all opposing. And we also heard from multiple members like, yes, this makes sense, but what are we going to do about those services that are funded through fees? And that's part of our roadblock because we're not able to trace it correctly because it's not reported correctly. So I'm also curious to see how that reporting requirement goes in California. Hopefully it has positive outcomes, and we can include something similar in New York. So yeah, we are actively talking to legislators about this unique opportunity that we have right now that we're not going to have in a while to use these funds. Also, we've seen from 2019, pre-pandemic, to 2020, New York State raised taxes on the wealthiest 1%, and we also see revenue bounce back from that. We have quite a bit. And so I don't go into a meeting without noting that, because I want to ensure that what we're using this money for is to fund those services equitably. This is our chance to really get in front of it, not just solve an issue, but proactively figure out ways to more fairly and equitably fund government. So it's an active part of our conversation in New York. And I think it's latching on. I'm hearing legislators begin to use it as well as we're thinking through this. But I would say that the only downfall to this is that we can't identify exactly how much. We have a lot of information on what's imposed, and we have revenue data on the county, county, town and village level, but we don't have what's collected, which is the missing piece to figure out how much exactly all of these new services would need. All of these services would need in new money. But I'm really excited that a part of a portion of our bill, parole supervision fees, is included in the governor's budget. So we have an opportunity to see the impact that has. And I'm sure that the governor already has a plan to backfill that. So we can kind of use that as a way to gauge how we will do it for the rest of the fees that are eliminated.
Commissioner Carter, I want you to answer the CERPA question, but I want to add something for you, which is, as the government representative here, you had to deal with the real budget implications of the fee work that you were doing. And can you talk a little about that? How did you manage that? How did that show up in Ramsey County? And as a commissioner, where that is part of your responsibility, how you dealt with it, right? We as advocates advocate for what we think is best, but we have different roles in this. And so I'd love to hear your sort of perspective on this.
I appreciate that. Again, PFM helped us to identify those areas we could go to. We were already doing some of this work, making those decisions. After the PFM study, we eliminated fines and fees for supervision and electronic home monitoring. That was $675,000 in our budget. The Ramsey County Commissary was an area where we looked to make sure that those costs were market aligned. I'm not exactly sure how much that was. We eliminated phone fees in the Ramsey County Correctional Facility. Well, we reduced them by $175,000 in 2020 through 2021. We're looking at that for further reduction and elimination in coming years. And we reduced pretrial services fees. In fact, those RFPs required that the vendor no longer charge for those pretrial services. We're looking at the law library fee, as I mentioned, that's another $600,000 that we don't control, and the adult detention center phone fees, and looking at that further reduction. Now, of the $12 million that we collected in 2018, there was only, I think, 8% that came back to us. So the problem for us isn't as big as the whole problem overall, but still, we had to address it. And we made some decisions. There were some incidentally fees that, if not collected, had their own cost that would walk away with them, but very, very little. We had to address it. And there were places where, because of reform in our system, we were able to contribute dollars to eliminate fees to help make those budgets whole. Now, some of those changes that I talked about in transforming our system in our juvenile area, instead of using for alternatives, we actually made a decision to plug into fines and fees. Again, we want to reserve those dollars for alternatives to ensure that the beds that aren't being used are help us to gain alternatives where kids can receive services in the community. And the same should be in the adult system over time as well. So we made those decisions with our dollars in some cases. We want to go deeper, and we don't want to continue making those decisions with property taxes. We are working with our legislators, and based on the PFM study, sharing with them areas where they can help. They are interested in the public safety reform and also in eliminating fines and fees as a part of that work. We are providing alternative ways in which the courts can charge. For example, for the law library, instead of charging every case, let's charge those professionals who use the law libraries. So alternative ways. With the surplus, it is clear we have an opportunity to request of our legislators and to work with our governor to plug some of those areas. If not, we will continue to need to do that from our property taxes, and that isn't sustainable.
Thank you.
I don't know if I answered all areas of your question.
Yes.
Remind me if it didn't touch.
Yes, definitely. And as we're coming close to the end, we do have one question in the Q&A that we want to pose to the panelists. The question says, on the phone justice issue specifically, I know that it can be very difficult for advocates to match the lobbying power of prison telecom companies like Securus or GTL. How did you all manage to counter their influence in your jurisdictions? And I'll leave that open to anyone who wants to answer.
This is actually happening live right now in New York. So this is a very timely question. And yes, I mean, the lobbying power of telecom is just rampant. It's not just in New York State, it's across the entire country. There are just a few companies that completely monopolize this entire industry. The way that we're using it in New York is that we are working alongside docs that works alongside with Securus. Securus is the telecom company that controls all of the phones in New York State. Docs kind of works with Securus, and we work along with docs, not in a way that we're together asking to eliminate phone call fees, but that we are doing some math to come up with our fiscal note that we're presenting to the legislature, that we're presenting to the governor, and then asking docs to work along with us to come up with their own fiscal note, and then do an analysis of both from their opinion and our opinion. One thing that we've been pointing to is the fact that docs in New York State is basing their fiscal note off of current rates for the phone calls, rather than the opportunity that we have to negotiate lower rates, which we're pointing to the state of Illinois doing some negotiation to negotiate rates down to 9/10 of a cent. So we know it's possible to negotiate lower rates, and we're using that example to kind of leverage our own in the state. Also, I think that because they're so powerful, we don't want to be antagonistic towards them in New York State at all. We seek and offer as many meetings as possible to understand their perspective. We come in pretty friendly and we get our point across, but we also leave the door open to kind of discuss some of the specifics of their concerns, which for phone calls, it's like creating the infrastructure and changing the operations in the facilities to meet the new demand of having X amount of minutes free per incarcerated person. That's an ongoing conversation, one where we welcome their thoughts and opinions in that in a way that doesn't harm us or waters down our bill. We will meet them where they are to hopefully, ease them off so that they're not openly antagonistic towards the bill. And so far it's been working. We don't have any expressed opposition from Securus, and we are also working with docs and don't have any expressed opposition from them either.
Great. And just one, oh, sorry, Commissioner Carter, were you going to respond to that?
I haven't fought the phone companies. I'll just briefly add, thank you for that. But that these contracts can sometimes masquerade as revenue contracts that actually add revenue to the budgets of our detention center facilities or correctional facilities. And once we got a beat on that, we were able to understand that as an area that we could make a decision on, rather than just looking at it as though it's not hurting our budget, it's not helping our community. So that was something we had to do. And then we could work on the negotiation around those costs, lowering them. And now, as I said, still looking at eliminating those costs as well.
I have one more thought. Something that we're also exploring in New York that has been done in other states is just changing the frame around how fees are charged. You no longer pay per minute for the phone on the outside. Like that's not how you pay for the phone line, and that's how that's done. So people behind bars, like the way that they're doing the phone call system is obsolete now. So modernizing it is also a strategy, making a completely different frame where you're paying for the phone lines. Also, along with needing free phone calls, there's going to have to be some updates to access and more phone calls. And some people are talking about tablets and different modes of communication. So just modernizing the whole system and getting these telecom companies to think about that and consider that is also something that we would consider. We haven't gotten there in New York yet, but I know that places like Connecticut have used a model like that, and now they have their free phone calls. So that's also a strategy.
Great. And just to wrap up sort of the conversation, has obviously been a very robust conversation, and we thank the panelists for their participation. But it's very clear that there is already a lot happening, but we do have to ask what's next for you guys in each of your jurisdictions. And I'll start with Antonia, since you already started to talk about what's next in terms of the phone call fees and that sort of thing. But yeah, just what's next for each of you, Antonia, Stephanie, and then Commissioner Carter.
I would say what's next is that we need to pass both of these bills, the Connecting Families Act, which is the phone call justice bill in New York, and the Predatory Court Fees Act. We're in the middle of having like some talks about the budget on both pieces of legislation. Budget negotiations are ongoing until the budget is due March 31st. So we're pushing as hard as possible there to see what we can get by April 1st. And then I think from there, we are really looking at creating a model to hopefully, if we're successful, kind of track what's going on, track implementation, and figure out what else needs to be done to continue to provide relief for the communities that need it. On a more simpler level, when it comes to just our work in general, we're hoping to replicate the work that we're doing on the state level in local communities. Specifically in New York, Buffalo has had egregious local fees that they were able to eliminate. We were also a part of that campaign, and they're looking to move towards some other things like removing officers from traffic enforcement. So we're hoping to support other local efforts like that. And then Long Island, we haven't even touched. They have a lot of fees. They have a lot of automated enforcement. And so we want to be able to use what we've learned on the state level to dig into the local level and help all of the communities across the state.
Lots going on. In California, I think we're going to be now on round 3 of our fee elimination efforts. And so, yeah, I think we're hopeful that we're, again, with this budget surplus, we'll be able to tack on another number of fees. The other thing that we're working on, and one of the things that we heard from our impacted members particularly was, fee elimination has been great and provided tremendous relief, but there's also huge amounts of debt stemming from restitution that is looming over people's head. And so we are starting what will be hopefully a first bill of another multi-year effort to begin tackling the system of restitution as a form of compensating survivors of harm. So the first bill that we're going to be working on is related to removing unpaid restitution as a barrier to getting expungement or record clearance relief. So yeah, that's kind of what's in store for us.
So what's next for us in Ramsey County is getting the phone numbers of everybody on this call so that we can emulate the work you're doing. Thank you so much. Secondly, of course, moving forward and working to create an opportunity for phone calls to be free in Ramsey County in both our correctional facility, where we will eliminate them, as well as in our adult detention facility, which is a short-term pretrial facility. We want to ensure that where we have fines or fees in particular in our county, that those have engaged the input of community members, particularly those most impacted, to understand how they match the values. If there are fees, then our community should support those fees. Otherwise, then we need to work toward eliminating them and clearly standing with our legislature, such as New York and California are doing, to make certain they hear from us and have the justification along with us to utilize whatever resources, including those that are available today in the surplus, to do that. Yeah. Lots ahead, and to look at this as a holistic system. So not just our justice system, but the entire system that impacts justice-involved folks as well as all of us.
And this was really amazing conversation, and there's so much to learn from all of you. And some of the really big takeaways for me today were how much the local work matters, how much the local and state work working together, how they're different, but they sort of plug into the same thing. And the more our state advocates can plug into the local groups, and the more the local groups can plug into the state advocacy, we can get further, hopefully faster, laying the foundation for all of this work and all the other work that we're doing all the time, and the driver's license work and the juvenile fines and fees work, in any place where fees are showing up, to start having these conversations and educating folks on what the problem is, especially this concept of criminalizing poverty and punishing people who are living in lower income circumstances more than we punish anybody else for these same things. Building coalitions and partnerships with everyone impacted, that's the individuals impacted, but all the places these things touch, right? All the systems they touch, all the actors they touch, so we can be working to get a better understanding so that we can move forward. How much data and process and understanding all of this really can feed shifting people's decision-making, right? That either we don't have any of this information, that's a problem in and of itself, or here is what we do know, right? And this is not lining up with who we are, as Commissioner Carter said, who we are as a community, where our values are being placed, what we say matters to us. This does not align with our practices and what we are actually doing day to day. And so really connecting those dots. And then that this is just, Stephanie talking about this third bill and the fourth time we're coming back is just a reminder to me that this is not a checklist. We're not checking off the issue, moving on to the next issue, but this is the work that we are all doing. And hopefully we're all in it for the long run, but it took a long time to get to this behemoth of a system that we are sitting inside of. It is not a snap your fingers and it's undone kind of thing, as much as I think many of us just wish it was, so we could do other things that bring us joy, because this work is really hard. It is really trying and it is very difficult, but it is long-term work. And so I like hearing these stories, hearing what you're doing, the wins, whether they be big or small, just are to me very, very like they just reinforce that we are all doing this together, even though none of us maybe are in the same state or working together, that this is a very large community of people that we don't even get to see and know that is doing this work. And the work of fees in particular is just really, and fines and fees and these financial burdens is really important, because nobody can pursue happiness or prosperity or any of these things that I think everyone is looking for in their own life with such a financial burden on their back. And so we need to be a part of creating pathways to prosperity for people. And this is a part of that work. So thank you everyone for coming today, being with your time, your resources, your energy, so great. And to our attendees who stayed on, thank you. And this webinar will be recorded and available, and you can reach out to any of us. You have questions and we will make sure that we get the right people in the right places. So thank you so much. And look forward for FFJC that we will be launching a national fee elimination campaign to really lift up the momentum in this space, to lift up this work and to connect people who are seeking to do it across the country. So more to come, but thank you so much for your time today. Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye,
Thank you,
everyone.
everyone.
Take care.
Bye. Take care.
Bye.